Welcome back to the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Cressey, and this is episode 197. We have our first ever three-time guest on today, and the reason we keep having him back is because he keeps coming up with more information to share, particularly in the realm of rotational power. Really cool insights, a lot of which is based on data we've collected at Cressey Sports Performance with our Proteus power testing to look at both males and females with respect to power loss with aging, looking at taller athletes versus shorter athletes with how they produce rotational power, and then looking at also, probably most importantly for this group, how we can kind of work to predict power and success in rotational sports with various tests in the sagittal plane, frontal plane, transverse plane, many of which are kind of derived from some of the Proteus tests we've done for both hitters and pitchers. So looking at pitching velocity, looking at hitting velocity, and figure out how we can kind of reverse engineer from some of these numbers, how to make athletes more powerful rotationally. So really cool stuff. After we did this podcast, it immediately impacted the way I wrote some programs and gave me some context to understand why maybe some athletes have had success in the past with our programs and where other folks may have struggled a little bit and we could have done it better. So one of those good things that you can really apply immediately. I think you'll really enjoy this conversation. This episode is brought to you by AG1, the most comprehensive NSF certified for sport daily nutritional supplement I've ever tried. With so many stressors in life, it can be difficult to maintain effective nutritional habits and give our bodies the nutrients they need to thrive. As a father of 3 young kids and a co-founder of multiple businesses in multiple states on top of still being an avid exerciser, I know that busy schedules can really take their toll on us. Whether it's poor sleep, exercise or life stressors, environmental factors, or simply not eating enough of the right foods, we can often wind up deficient nutritionally. This is where AG1 can really help. It's a game-changing nutritional insurance policy. They simplify the logistics of getting optimal nutrition on a daily basis by giving you just one thing with all the best things. That's why I use it daily, as do several of my family members, and we recommend it to a lot of our top athletes. One scoop of AG1 contains 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced ingredients that work together to fill the nutritional gaps in your diet to support energy, focus, digestion, and recovery. And this can all happen for less than $3 per day and without taking multiple products. While most nutritional supplements come to market and stay stagnant, AG1 continues to obsessively improve this one holistic formula based on the latest research, producing over 50 improvements in the last decade alone. They invest in the most absorbable and natural source of each ingredient and go above and beyond in third-party testing to ensure their customers continue to receive the highest quality and best tasting nutrition happen on the planet. Whether you're keto, paleo, vegan, dairy-free, or gluten-free, it'll work for you, and it contains less than 1 gram of sugar per serving. They put 75 ingredients through the rigorous NSF certification test to come up with a safe formula that's trusted by some of the world's top athletes, including many of our own at Cressey Sports Performance. Right now, AG1 is giving our listeners a special offer of 10 free travel packets with their first purchase. Just head to drinkag1.com/Cressey and claim this special offer. These travel packets are perfect for supporting your immune system, energy, and gut health while you're traveling for games, training, or simply on the go. They can be great counterbalance to the less than ideal on-the-road food options that are out there for a lot of our traveling baseball players. So if you want to bridge the gap between deficient and optimal and give yourself the best chance of getting nutrient diversity, head to drinkag1.com/Cressey to get 10 free travel packets with your first purchase. Again, that's drinkag1.com/Cressey, CRESSEY. You won't regret it. Today's guest, Will Waterman, is the head of performance and sports science at Proteus. Previously, he practiced as a physical therapist for 10 years with roles as the head physical therapist with DePaul University's athletes and Stanford Healthcare. He received his BS in exercise and sports science from the University of Georgia before receiving his doctorate in physical therapy from the Medical College of Georgia. Will has pursued multiple specialties, including board certifications as an orthopedic clinical specialist from the American Physical Therapy Association, his postural restoration certification from the Postural Restoration Institute, a certification as an orthopedic manual therapist from the Ola Grimsby Institute, and a certification as a strength and conditioning specialist from the National Strength and Conditioning Association. Will, you are our first third-time guest on the podcast, so congratulations on that great honor, and thank you for carving out some time.
Thank you very much. It's always an honor to be here, and I always love our conversation, so excited.
Well, and this is also, I think, the earliest podcast I've ever done. I'm recording this at 7 a.m. my time. You're across the pond now. You're a London resident for a bit to see where that takes you. So thank you
Mhm.
for matching up timeline schedules and all that stuff too.
I should be thanking you. It's a nice, midday podcast for me. You're the one that's getting up early, so
It's
I
all
just
good.
appreciate helping me avoid a 2, 3 a.m. recording. So
Oh,
I
you're good.
appreciate
Three kids at home. I'm always up early, so it's an easy one. But to kind of kick things off. So as I mentioned, this is the third time on the show. You and Sam did it together first go around, and then we actually had you on for the second appearance in June of 2023.
it.
It was kind of like I think we called it the state of power, just because that was basically a second iteration of your appearance because on the first one, we talked a lot about like what Proteus is, how we thought we could use it, but it was a little bit more preliminary. We heard the story behind it. The second time around, though, we started to collect some data. And here we are 14 months later with way more data, a lot of other stuff. So I thought it'd be cool to kind of do an update for folks. But maybe the best place to start is give us an update on what's evolved. How is Proteus different now than it was, early summer 2023?
Sure. So yeah, since then we have massively grown our database. And I knew that we were going to have this conversation, so I actually pulled some numbers here to kind of, go into some of these things and share with your listeners. So, we now have over 75,000 users, ranging from anywhere from like 8 to 98 years old, and we have now tested over 40 different sports. And if you look at our user base, really the Gen Pop population is what's grown the most since the last time we talked. We went from about 10% of our total user base to over 20%, with the largest kind of fastest growing segment being that 30 to 50-year-old crowd. So that's something that's been really exciting to us because we've been perceived as such an athlete centric technology. It's still by far 80% of our user base is athletes. So it's our biggest population. College and high school is our largest population of of that subset. So if you're looking at the 80% being athletes, 30% are high school, 15% are college. But we still test, over 10% of our user population to professional athletes. So we have tons of data. If you look at that, over 75,000 users, 10% being professional athletes means we have, really a great data set for those peak performers. So, that's, if you really kind of then do the math, it's over 1 billion data points that we've collected. It's over 100,000 tests. It's somewhere between, since the last time I checked, anywhere from like 150 to 200,000 tests that we've performed. And we're on track for about 500 sites by the end of this year. So, right now we're over 400. And since the last time we've talked, I think the last time we talked, it was right before we were, in the Netflix docuseries Quarterback, where Patrick Mahomes is using us. So obviously that had a nice little bump for us with his coach Bobby Stroob. He loves Proteus, and he's kind of a mad scientist type of trainer. So we got a nice boost in football and quarterbacks in particular using the product. And then, like I said, we've expanded into that Gen Pop space, but also in the sports space, golf use and testing golf facilities and combat sports has another kind of fast area of growth for us. So we've seen a lot of these golf facilities use Proteus as both a testing and training device because of its rotational testing and training abilities. And that's really taken off. We're at TPC Sawgrass now. There's a lot of professional golfers that are using the product regularly. And we've, previously released in some of our own podcasts and stuff, talked about, testing with golf and some correlations to performance that are, very similar to some of the stuff, we have talked about with baseball, and we'll talk about today with benefits from baseball. And then if we just talk about the evolution of the product, the product is always changing from a software perspective. So since we've talked, we've launched a velocity-based training features. So that's both in the testing and the training side. So from the testing side, when you perform a test, particularly our most popular sports test, the Cressey performance test,
Yeah.
it's done the most on. It's
Terrible
one of
name,
our,
but great test, right?
yeah. It's performed the most of any of our tests on all of our systems for athletes. And if you look at that, at the end of the test, we now have a recommendations section that comes out that actually tells you how that athlete should train optimally based on the comparative data of that athlete against other athletes like them. So it'll say, hey, they need to train strength, power, or speed based on their test results. And then that actually gives them a range of, velocities to train in. So obviously strength, it's anywhere from obviously not zero, but 0 to 0.75 meters a second. We have that power range, which I'm obviously, we've kind of dumbed it down, 0.75 to 1.25. There's obviously strength, speed, and speed strength within that. And then obviously the speed over 1.25 meters a second. So we actually have that in the testing recommendations where it tells our clients and our coaches how they should be training those athletes. And then we actually have a velocity-based training feature in our freestyle mode so that you can actually use Proteus as a velocity-based training tool. And so you can set the velocity you want to train in. It'll tell you if you're going too fast or too slow, and which will then tell you if you're going too fast to increase the weight. So that it makes, if that athlete's moving at max velocity, they're staying in the zone that they need to be training in. So that's come out. We've made some big changes as well into our reporting as well, including kind of a new power age feature where we actually tell you what your power age is compared to what your age your chronological age is. We have some other new features that released, that's an automatic program generator that will actually spit out a generic program based on those test results. So you get those test results and it tells you should train for power, strength, speed, etc. We have the option now, and this actually just released this past week actually, and maybe when this is recorded, been 2 weeks ago, but where it will, when you're done with the test, you can tap a button that says generate program, and then it'll create a 4-week training program, and you get to tell the system, do you want this to be in a home gym? Do you want it to be in a sports performance facility? Or do you want it to be in a kind of what we'd call a commercial gym? And obviously that changes the equipment selection. But then based on their, also another factor that you can put in there is you ask the person their training age. So if they have less than 1 year experience of training, or 1 to 2 years, or 2+ years. And then based on that, we will then take their Proteus test results, whether they should train strength, power, speed, etc., and spit out this 4-week program that, based on whatever they test, it'll, whatever movements they're tested, it'll give you actual exercise recommendations and progress them for you, or give you, suggested progressions for those 4 weeks. So we have that came out, as well as another pilot program we're doing where we're actually doing an even more personalized program that actually feeds into like a team builder custom workout program. So lots of things have changed, and then as you mentioned, all that, I moved to London. So
pretty dull year, right? Maybe the first place to start. So last time around when we talked, one of I think the key takeaways from that conversation was, power kind of gets you from high school to college, and skill gets you from college to professionals. Like the increase in power, those qualities were not as substantially different when we compared a college to a pro demographic as, if we took a 17-year-old and compared him to a 21-year-old. So the assumption was like, hey, you need to get, more physical, which isn't out of the ordinary, but I think we saw it in a little bit, maybe a more nuanced way when we talked about power and acceleration. But I think the other end of the spectrum, we're also appreciating power losses, how people may fall off and what that might mean, not just for, lifespan, but for health span. And this term powerpenia is a little bit of an industry buzzword that we're hearing a lot more. I actually love it, just because we're, I think we're a little bit more aware of the functional element. I think in the past we worried about sarcopenia, where it's just muscle loss, but in reality, it's way more about how that impacts functionality. So maybe I'll punt to you here is, digging on what it is, and then maybe some of the research that you've seen, abroad, and then also more internally here to Proteus.
Yeah. Oh no, it's great. We saw this term pop up, powerpenia, and we dove all over it because we've already been looking at the some of this data ourselves, but I think it was like Freitas et al. Was the person who group that first coined this term, and he's actually a physician researcher based in Portugal, who actually reached out to us after we did some posts about powerpenia. So I actually talked to him. It was pretty cool. But I think he kind of came up with this term, and then it got popularized by like some of these other influential people like Andrew Huberman, Peter Attia, and Andy Galpin, who were all talking about it a lot, and how power lost with age is this new kind of biomarker for aging that they need to pay attention to. And kind of the general research says that it's roughly 10% per decade or 1% per year, after age 30. That's roughly what the general research said. So we just wanted to say, well, okay, we have the largest data set of power-based movements in the world now. So what does our data say? Does it mirror that research that's been done, elsewhere, or is it different? And how does it different from, different types of movements? And so, to kind of keep this really simple, we started by just looking at our general power test, which is after the Cressey power test, our most performed, test that's done. That's really just aimed at looking at power for the whole body. It looks at multiple planes, looks at upper body, core, legs, and we just said, okay, let's look at that, and let's look across the entire lifespan and see how power changes. And it was over 5,500 users that we narrowed this down to, where we could be confident we had good data on who they were and all this stuff. And essentially, our data mirrored that other data. And essentially, we see a 10% reduction in power per decade of life after age 30. But what's interesting is there's differences between men and women. And this isn't something we'd really seen in the other research. This is something I think that we're the first to really bring this out to. So what we would notice is for men, it's a very steady decline. And for those who are listening, you can't see me do my hand here, but it's a just steady decline from 30, where it's roughly 9 to 10% per decade, give or take, for men, where they're dropping. Whereas women, they actually don't drop as fast. They peak a little earlier. They actually peak in their 20s, and instead of their 30s, and it's a much less of a decline that they get until they get to about 60 to 70, and then it drops off significantly compared to the men that we've tested. So they actually lose less power over their lifespan, at least with the population we've tested, and then drop off a cliff. So by their 70s, men have lost about 40% overall of power by our data, whereas women end up losing 53% of their total power capabilities. But it's just because they have this drop off in their 60s. If they didn't have that drop off, they would have lost less power than men by the time they hit that same 70s decade of life. So we found that really interesting, right? Like, this is a completely different data set that we've seen, where we were able to compare men and women. But then we also wanted to look at the differences in the movements, right? So like I said, we're testing full body. We can test sagittal plane movements, which are the primary movements that people tend to train. And then we're also testing rotational movements, testing vertical jumps. And what's really interesting is we see, and we theorized this. I think everyone would predict this, but what did we actually find? We guessed we would see a sharper decline in power for rotational movements than, because people just don't train it. Maybe it's just an inherent thing with physiology. You tend to restrict rotation first after an injury, then kind of frontal plane, then sagittal plane. At least from my experience as a physical therapist, right? But it was really interesting. The rotational data, if you look at that same group, you see that by their 70s, you lose about 44% of your power is lost from rotational movements, whereas for those sagittal plane movements, it's only 30%, right? 30 to 35, depending on the movement. So you see a much larger loss in power for those rotational movements. And this being said, if you're going to critique our research, we probably have a very athletic population that's testing on Proteus. You know what I mean? It's not the typical American population that's testing, right? Like, I predict we would see a much larger decrease if we were to test, say, across a much broader spectrum of, standard
Yeah.
American population. So yeah, it kind of confirms what we suspect. Rotation is lost, at a faster rate, and that power is lost as we age. But what's really interesting is if you look at people that are basically, if you look at just the top percentile of power producers, so people that are in that 95th percent or above, or even, sorry, excuse me, 90th percent or above of power, the decline is much less over time. And obviously, we haven't tested the same people across their entire lifespan, but the implication is if you already have power, you will maintain power for a longer period of time versus if you don't have power. So it really just gives more credence to you need to train it. If you don't use it, you lose it. And there's plenty of research to show you can still gain power. And our own data says the same. You can still gain power no matter how old you are.
Yeah.
So that's kind of been the overall findings. And once we dug into that, and then we also looked at things around height and height to weight ratios. So stuff that might be more applicable to sport. For instance, as people get taller, they tend to have ability to generate more power or generate more acceleration, but it levels off after a certain point. And then also the BMI, for instance, we're like, hey, we got all this data on these people. Let's look at BMI. And, obviously BMI is a, height to weight ratio. Anything over 25 to 30 is considered overweight. You're considered unhealthy. Anything above 30 is considered obese. Well, 28 is where we saw power, peak the most, which, kind of is also always been a critique about BMIs. It's not good for athletes.
Yeah.
Well, this kind of showed, kind of confirmed that our peak power productions at the 28 mark, it's almost in the obese category. It's, kind of on the higher end of the overweight category. And that's probably just because these people possess more muscle, right?
Yep.
Which is, they're being, quote unquote, penalized by BMI, by, having more muscle. So anyways, if we kind of go back to that Powerpedia thing, it's the overall statement is you do lose it if you don't train it, but we strongly think that if you train it, you will maintain it. And that's just very important as we age.
I want to, there's a lot of really good stuff in there. So I want to hit it sequentially. I thought the male female thing was particularly fascinating and on a couple of fronts. I think the first thing is you can't be rotationally powerful if you can't rotate. Right. And I think if we look at the training and the gender difference in male and female, first off, women we know have more laxity, right? So if you have looser joints, you have more ligamentous give, you're going to be able to find those positions. Conversely, you have males, and if you put them in the exact same, life environment in their 20s, males are going to lose range of motion faster. It's just the nature of it. But I think second, that's probably more significant is the amount of transference versus interference in the standard training, right? Like go to any yoga class, it's typically going to be 90+% female, right?
Yeah.
Go to any, gym where people are lifting really, really heavy stuff, it's going to be 90% male. And that's a gross gender stereotype. So I'm careful about how I relate those things, but we generally know that you lift a lot of really heavy stuff. You often have very high force strategies. Bill Hartman has done a great job talking about this. And those are the individuals that do lose rotational capacity versus, a collection of a population who either does nothing or, does something that would preserve range of motion. It certainly lends credence to the idea of like, if you don't use it, you lose it. And it makes sense that males would lose it much, much faster. I think also, I look at how activity levels change, right? We all have these buddies that, they finish college sports or, they finish in high school, whatever it is. And, they go out and they play beer league softball or, pick up hockey or whatever it is, ultimate Frisbee. And then around 28, they start pulling their hammies every time they go out there. There's some kind of, they hurt their wrist on a slide, whatever it is. And it seems like guys do less dumb stuff like that in their 30s. Maybe it's an element of responsibility. Maybe it's having kids and life gets busy and all that stuff. But people don't realize that those activities are the things that are preserving rotational capacity. So I think the lesson for us is, from an overall training standpoint, particularly as athletes age, we can't assume it's just going to be in there. We need to attack it. But what I'm even more fascinated about, I want to get your take on this just because I know you've scrutinized the data set more than anybody else. And I've talked about this in the past. I can't tell you how often we get a kid that was in a college weight room for 4 years who has, you know, who came in as this springy, fascially driven, 6'3", 195-pound athlete throwing in the low 90s, and they get up to 210 or so, and they're throwing harder, and everything's going great, and then they kind of steadily fall off, and we get them when they're 21, 22 after they've entered pro ball or they've graduated college, and they're literally just blocks that have lost a lot of rotational capacity. There's 5 or 10 degrees of hip internal rotation. There's 50 degrees of thoracic rotation. It's just not enough to make this stuff work. So I'm curious, like, do you think rotational athletes are even training rotation enough? And that sounds very counterintuitive for a baseball player that's out there hitting baseballs, throwing baseballs, stealing bases, changing directions and things like that. But do you think they're even exposed to it enough? I guess the end ranges that we need to preserve those rotational capacities.
Yeah, I mean, especially putting on my background as a physical therapist, I know that, and like I mentioned before, rotation's the first thing you lose when you
Yeah.
have any sort of, injury, like,
Yeah.
because it requires the most stability,
Yeah.
right? From the body, your brain is going to shut that down as a way to create more stability around a joint before it's going to shut down, say, frontal plane or sagittal plane movement. It's just the nature of how the body works. It's a hierarchy. So certainly as athletes, increase volume, or, maybe in a college setting, or doing heavier, types of training that are maybe going to create more insults to the ligamentous tissue, insults to the fascial tissue, they're going to have to do things to maintain that rotational ability more than when they were younger, right? And that's tissue was fresher, and it's just going to create a more of a demand to, in my opinion, to maintain that tissue. So in those key joints, you want to do those checks and make sure that they're staying mobile, so that they possess the range of motion, so that then they can then develop that stability and force production and power across those joints, and then obviously put that all together sequentially. And so I think you probably see this a lot, and probably know more than me, but I think when athletes transition into, like, say like high school to college, college to pro, there's probably various levels of personalization that some of them do and don't get. And a lot of these people, or a lot of these athletes, are probably, maybe have trained in the high school and were very well kept, and we're talking about the best athletes. They were, a lot of attention was paid to them. They had a great, coach with them. They had a great trainer. They were in this one development with this one person for years and years and years. And then they moved to college and they're kind of off on their own. And now
Yeah.
they're a small, fish in a big pond. And maybe they get a little more lost, and their routines change. And that, all that, I think, can really affect their ability to maintain some of those things. So when I think of that kid that you mentioned, that's to me is what I think of is maybe one of those reasons. But like I said, you're going to have more experience than I am.
And maybe building on the other one is, that height weight ratio with respect to power development to me is pretty fascinating. I think, like we've always kind of used like 2.75 times height in inches as like the body weight in pounds that we kind of use as our
Mm.
baseline. So I use the example of a 6'3" athlete, 6'3", 205. Like, I just know that if athlete gets to 6'3" or 205, then we can actually scrutinize stuff. And don't get me wrong, they're going to be generational talents who can be 180 at 6'3" and throw 100. Like, you look at the Jacob DeGroms and the Tristan McKenzie of the world who are making it work. Those guys are obviously built, very, very differently. But I've also seen guys who were 6'3", 235 and thought it was going to work out great, and they couldn't even cover first base. They just got way too big. Do you think that maybe that 28 BMI is maybe a little bit of a new standard that maybe gives us a little bit more insights as to how this might work out a little bit better when we talk about gradually adding body weight and rotational sport athletes?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting because when you look at it for baseball, like what I talked about just then, that was for the overall population. And for baseball, it's the same number. It's basically 27 for women, and that's for softball actually, and then 28 for men. And what we see is the power just peaks at that point, and then it just slightly trails off. Like it stays pretty high. Obviously, if we're testing an athletic population, and their power output is going to be pretty high even when they get in that 30 over 30 kind of range. It's not like we see a big drop off
Yeah.
because they're athletes, right? But in the general population, obviously you're going to see a big drop after they get to that over 30, because now you're getting to people that are just, they don't have as much lean tissue, right? They're just overweight and obese, and so they don't have the athleticism to back up that number. They don't have the muscle mass. So I do think, it's something that coaches have mentioned for a long time, is, BMI being a terrible, way to assess this. And I think for both men and women, it's much more of an important thing to pay attention to, or to maybe kind of aim for. It's like you need more of this muscle mass to achieve these athletic goals. And our data just backs that up, that the
Yeah.
highest performers are people in this category.
Yeah. And it tells us where the point of diminishing returns is. I mean,
Right.
while you're talking, I just pulled up the BMI chart at the NIH website, and 6'3", it's a BMI of 28 is 224. So like it kind of jives with like, hey, being a lot heavier than that, the juice may not be worth the squeeze. So it's just,
Right.
all we're asking for are checkpoints where we need to kind of like start having more conversation with athletes. But by all means, if you got a weight room full of 6'3", 160-pound guys, like take the weight room directly to the buffet line. Like that's the way to get these guys better. But I do think having like a collection of data is really, really important. Maybe building on top of that, you spoke kind of offline when we talked weeks ago, is we've looked at our data sets a lot more in a detailed way. And more specifically, I think one of the things that we struggle with, force plates can have a ton of merit for hitters. I think there's a lot of stuff that we can use where we work into the ground, both for hitters, long drivers, that can predict, exit velocity, obviously how hard they swing in golf. But it's somewhat challenging when we talk about pitching. And that could be in part because it's very nuanced how you impart force to a baseball, right? If you're throwing a 90% spin efficiency fastball that's an accidental cutter, like it's never going to be perfect. So you kind of have to match certain things for certain things. But we have seen some interesting information come out of some of these Proteus tests. So maybe you could talk about some of the key takeaways in pitchers and how maybe we can layer our classic sagittal plane assessments, whether they're vertical jumps, they're force plate jumps, whatever it may be, with what we're learning rotationally.
Yeah, so we dove into this ourselves, because we know we work with you and we can like kind of look at your athletes. We did our own kind of analysis where we're saying, okay, how do we tie, peak velocity for that pitchers can achieve to Proteus data? And the best way that we thought to do that was to look at actual in-season data and tie it to their Proteus data that we know that they did in a great, controlled environment, which is at Cressey Sports Performance. So since we've talked, the last time that we did this, we looked at the basically the Proteus power of pitchers at your facility from the 22 to 2023 off season, right? So we looked at that data, and then we looked at their peak numbers they achieved in the 2023 season, basically to say, okay, how does that power correlate to their performance? And essentially, we then looked at all the movements in the Cressey performance test, right? Because this was the standardized test that we wanted to put this against. And essentially, it broke down to there were 4 key data points that correlated highest to their actual throwing velocity, which was vertical jump acceleration, PNF D2 extension. So for those who aren't, can't see me, that's basically doing somewhat like a throwing type motion across the body. It's going from above the head down across the body, D2 extension, but that specifically power and acceleration for that. So both power and acceleration. And then the shot put, power and acceleration values. So if we looked at that, we could actually then see, okay, compare that against the athletes that were throwing. And we actually developed almost like normative data sets for what is needed to, say, achieve 95 plus miles an hour. So for instance, on the vertical jump, you need 15.7 meters a second squared. For the acceleration, you need 114 watts of power, and the D2 extension, 8.8 meters second squared in acceleration. Shot put, you need over 415 watts of power, and your acceleration needs to be over 15 meters a second squared. So we have that for 95. We have that same data for 92 to 95 and 90 to 92. So like we kind of able to put these into buckets and help us understand what movements are even important. So if we were to say redesign the Cressey test to just be the most efficient test we could do, we now could boil it down to those three being the most important ones. And obviously shorten the data collection times, but obviously if you think about it, it all makes sense why those movements will transfer. Vertical jump, acceleration, how quick, how is your lower body able to impart force into the ground? That obviously shot put, that's your ability to translate that into rotation from the ground up through the core and into the upper body. And then lastly, that D2 extension element, which is, we hadn't really until now been able to establish anything for the upper extremity of that could give us an idea of actual shoulder health or performance and how that relates to throwing performance. Well, D2 extension by far outperformed all other measures of, press or rows or anything like that. Biceps, triceps, any other thing we tested, that D2 extension was the one that really, isolated performance the most.
And effectively, it recreates arm speed, right? That it takes to throw a baseball. That's the thing I think people, we've done a lot of really cool stuff with Thea, our markerless biomechanics setup at CSP. And one of the remarkable things about the data set is we'll roll stuff out where you actually look at it and you're looking at some of these big league guys who are throwing in the mid 90s actually have what you would maybe consider to be underwhelming angular velocity of shoulder internal rotation. It makes very little sense, but what they're doing in their lower half is so efficient, and how they're imparting force to the baseball. So those are the guys that might screen out as being, maybe not great testers on that D2 extension. So like you said, it's how do you interact with the ground? How do you transfer force? And then what can you actually do with your arm? And there are some people that just have freakishly quick arms that maybe have flat butts and an ability to do things down there, but it works. And those are often our narrow infrasternal angles, our fascially driven athletes who are just, ultra springy and wiry and make it work for them. So I think it's always about reverse engineering what you have in front of you and like, hey, where are the weaknesses in this and what can we pattern a little bit differently?
And that's the thing is, if you have this data, you can see and you might remember we sent you a chart of your athletes, and basically we took a few names and we said, look, this athlete is a 95 mile per hour plus jumper and shot putter, but the arm is in the like 90 mile per hour category, right? So like it kind of shows you like their quote unquote weakness, at least from like our data set, is the arm. So maybe
sometimes it may be a guy who's like injured, right? It's hard to really turn it loose on one of those. It's effectively a PNF pattern with load, but it's hard to really turn it loose on one of those if you got a history of anterior instability or biceps tendinopathy or something like that. So it's kind of a double screening tool. I was like, hey, is this athlete that had that injury in the past still tentative and afraid to let it eat? Because if so, that's not where we want to be.
Yeah. And I think that's really what our goal is, to like just bring this stuff to the surface more. If we have this data out there, which we're going to publish a lot of this data not too long after this conversation, we're going to kind of share this and say, hey, look, here's what we found are the norms, right, for these athletes. And obviously this is going to change over time as we get better data. We look at different times a year. These numbers will probably shift a little bit, but generally speaking, here are the milestones you want to that we see you should achieve. And again, if you have someone that's underperforming in one area but overperforming in another, that makes sense and gives credence to those things that you're seeing with your eye, you're seeing in the actual biomechanical data. And if you can marry those things and say improve that power and force production in those kind of weak elements of the chain, it's only certainly going to have a benefit for the athlete. particularly if it's in a pain-free range of motion, et cetera. So, that's really what our why we want to dig into this data and publish it, is because it's going to give all of our clients and people that are using this
Yeah.
data a huge leg up.
We interrupt this podcast with a quick reminder that this episode is brought to you by AG1. It's an NSF certified all-in-one superfood supplement that features 75 whole food sourced ingredients designed to support your body's nutritional needs. I use this product daily myself, and a ton of our athletes do as well. Head to drinkag1.com/Cressey and claim my special offer of 10 free travel packets with your first purchase. AG1 gives you peace of mind that you're covering all your nutritional bases. Again, that's drinkag1.com/Cressey, CRESSEY, and you'll get that special offer. Yeah, and I think that, not to get out over my skis and start, talking questions before I was going to ask him later on. But like, I think the next step is obviously have this data and then track injury rates, right? If we're seeing this glaring issue from a performance standpoint, like, first off, what's our asymmetry data look like relative to oblique strains in the 12 months that follow, right? What does our D2 extension number look like relative to elbow injuries or anterior shoulder pain or whatever it is? How does it relate to, man games lost on the IL? That's the stuff that I think is really, really powerful, because everyone knows that, if we're talking about improving performance, keeping guys healthy should not be mutually exclusive, right? There's an efficient way to move, to transfer force, all that stuff. So we want to make sure that we're checking both boxes. Sorry, soapbox moment, but talking about the hitters, right? We talked about pitchers, what guys need to do to throw hard, but what about guys that want to hit homers?
Yeah, I mean, this one, we kind of did a similar thing, looked at a big data set, and essentially in this one, what we found was shot put, straight arm trunk rotation, and vertical jump were the biggest ones. So shot put power, we saw that if you gain 50 watt, every 50 watts you gain on shot put, that's one more mile per hour that you gain on the exit velo, right? So I'll say it again, every 50 watts on the shot put, that's another mile per hour you gain on exit velo. And we look at
just so folks have this for context, when you do a Proteus power test and you're talking about a professional baseball player, a guy hitting a ball anywhere from maybe 105 to 112, whatever it may be, like, what kind of like power ranges are you looking at in that demographic? And then maybe throw out what you would see in like a high school junior or something like that that's trying to get with it. And it's hard because you're comparing aluminum bats, wood bats, all that stuff as well. But
I can do this. I can tell you based on the velocity ranges, what the wattage ranges are.
Yeah.
So, because now we have that data. So, for instance, if we're looking at just the shot put, I can tell you that 100 plus miles an hour, which is probably going to be those, more elite athletes.
Yeah.
They're in anywhere from 400 watts to, and with 20 plus meters a second squared acceleration. So, or they have 450 watts and they're over 15 meters a second squared in acceleration. So you have two kind of different strategies there, right? You can either have more power and a little less acceleration, which just means your velocities probably a little, ultimately a little higher, but you're getting there a little later, or you're getting there very quickly. But that's the 100 plus mile per hour range. And then we have the same data for, say, like the 94 to 99 mile per hour, and then below, 94. So if you're looking at anywhere from 350 to 400 watts for the 94 to 99, and you're looking at, basically below 350 for under 93 miles an hour, that's roughly how it breaks down. So you'll probably have to tell me kind of where those averages live in the college, professional, and high school game.
It's funny. You answered my question, and in the meantime, I thought you made an awesome point on something it's different. Like, I've always talked to athletes about like strong versus springy, kind of like that static strength continuum, or static spring, I should say. You go back and you remember like the Mark McGwire home runs. Like it almost seemed like the ball sat on his bat, and he kind of just like muscled it out of the stadium. It had a slow, strong look to it. You would never call like a McGwire home run elastic. At that same time frame though, like you remember like a Gary Sheffield like home run, like crazy bat speed, incredibly elastic. Obviously nowadays guys like O'Neal Cruz, those guys are elite elasticity. Maybe not, maybe a Pete Alonso was a stronger guy with, maybe a little bit less of an elastic component. But then you take a guy like a Barry Bonds, right? And independent of discussions of how it went down and all that stuff, but a freaky elastic athlete who early in his career obviously had a lot of those crazy bat speed home runs and then got stronger, got bigger, put muscle mass in the right place. And you're looking at obviously one of the greatest home run hitters of all time because of it. And he probably was able to cover the plate a lot differently. That's what happens when it's easier to make a fast guy strong than it is to make a strong guy fast. But it just speaks to like, you have data now that shows how guys are making baseballs go fast in completely different ways.
And we can even add to that because I don't even know if I shared this with you, but we actually then took that a step further because we were saying, okay, we're looking at this data, but let's look at the different body types. Let's look at tall athletes versus shorter athletes.
Yeah.
And some of this stuff is kind of obvious. If someone with long lever arms it produces the same amount of power, let's say hits 400 watts, and the same and an athlete who's shorter also has to get to that 400 watt mark. What we see is that 400 watts mark, the shorter athlete obviously has to have much higher acceleration values to achieve that same power output. And they just have less time in their swing and their range of motion to get to that peak value. So if we actually look at our data, you'll see across this, kind of, height spectrum, the shorter athletes that are achieving the same power levels as the taller athletes have much, much higher acceleration values. So, obviously some of those athletes you talked about were of different heights as well.
Yeah.
And, I think that really gives you, another kind of element on how you might want to train someone.
Yeah.
Based on just their lever arms. I mean,
so if you've got a 5'9" second baseman that is hitting balls 103 and you want to hit them 110, your avenue is being a lead accelerator. Like putting 100 pounds on that back squat is probably not going to give you the same carryover as learning to move really, really fast, just because you don't have you just don't have the biomechanics to develop it over a slower, longer period of time.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same reason why most pitchers are really tall, right? Like, you just get, obviously there's people that defy that, but generally speaking, they're tall. They have more time to hit a peak velocity.
Yeah.
I think what's really interesting though is I think with the swing, there's probably a little bit more room in that the range of motion differences are probably not as vast between like the taller athlete and shorter athlete. So if they really focus on that acceleration, it's probably going to have a greater impact for them than say like trying to, they're going to have a greater potential to hit those numbers, say than, a shorter athlete who's trying to be a really, really elite thrower, that probably the range of motion differences there are probably larger, I would guess, for throwing versus for hitting. So, that's at least my kind of like reason why I think you'll probably see more successful, like shorter athletes still achieve like really high levels of bat speed.
Yeah, this is your Altuves, your Pedroias, guys that have done it at shorter statures because there are really efficient accelerators in tight windows. So
right. And you can just do that with that range of motion difference for the tall and the short athletes. Not like really, really vast. Like, they're not, their arms aren't fully extended.
Yeah.
When they're doing the hitting, at least they shouldn't be.
Yeah. Did you see anything in the pitching world that kind of I guess relates to that? Obviously, we're talking about hitting and stuff, but we look at taller athletes. Obviously, they generally make more successful pitchers, presumably because they can leverage gravity a little bit differently, all that stuff. But we do see guys that are 5'9", 5'10" that are pitching in the big leagues. Do you think that there are implications for speaking with the pitchers? Is that something we need a little bit more research to kind of dig in on?
I mean, we looked at the same data and it basically just showed a pretty linear relationship. As you get taller, your ability to generate power just goes up, but there's kind of a threshold. So like over 6'4" or so, it's kind of diminishing returns, like, and there's probably some biomechanical reason for that, right? Like it's not like once you get to like the 7 feet mark, I don't think the ability to throw hard is going to be as much different than someone who's like 6'6" or 6'4". But our data, at least for now, does show that generally it goes up. Same with acceleration. We haven't really looked at, say, like a tall pitcher versus a short pitcher and looked at their differences in their numbers. That's something that would be really interesting to do, and say like, oh, is their acceleration for that shorter athlete, a lot higher, say, because they're shorter. So would we see that same type of relationship that we do with hitters? I can't really say. I would imagine that was probably what is going to happen. But I couldn't confirm that with the data yet.
It's interesting too. And this may not be accurate anymore, but at one point I recall hearing that in the tennis community, it was 19 of the top 20 players in the world were 6 feet tall or more. And that was very different. Like we obviously grew up in the era of like the Michael Changs and some of these longer, or sorry, these shorter guys that could, rely heavily on, elite agility and stuff like that. That may not be nearly as accurate, but the game is definitely more powerful than it was previously. So there may be lessons to learn across other sports. Maybe you already gave the answer with some of the height, weight, particularly the acceleration, feature in shorter athletes. But do you look at rotational power differently now than you did, 3 years ago when we had that first podcast? What's your 15-second elevator pitch on how, rotation is different in the eyes of Will Waterman?
Oh man, it's really just boils down to test, don't guess. That's
Yeah.
it. I mean, like you different athletes have different needs. And what this data shows us is we have athletes, sure, there's trends, and there's obviously always going to be fundamental things of like you need to develop strength before you develop speed. Strength and power and speed is kind of like roughly the hierarchy. You need these baselines. But then once you're working with athletes that already possess that baseline, if you really want to get the most efficient training you can, you need to test their abilities, and you can train specifically for these qualities. And you can really help an athlete save, especially these days with the seasons being longer and their training sessions, training season being much shorter. If you want to get the most for that athlete you can, you need to test specifically what they need, and then give them that. And so, obviously that goes to the cases you might bias still like a shortened athlete into training more acceleration, et cetera. But generally speaking, that's the main thing that I would do. And then when it comes to rotation, I think the other thing is like when we're looking at our data, it backs up the data that's already been out there, right? That's already said like, hey, power comes from the legs and you transfer it through the core and body. And then you then have to express it through your upper extremity. And I'm obviously talking about, baseball, golf, tennis, these rotational sports. But if we're looking at the general test of how I would now test and then therefore train rotational athletes, it really comes down to like 4 or so movements. For baseball in particular, it's 4 that matter the most. It's vertical jump for no matter if you're a pitcher or a hitter. It's vertical jump. It's power for hitters. It's acceleration for throwers, right? But then trunk rotation, it's power and acceleration. Acceleration matters more for hitters. It's power and acceleration for throwers. It's shot put, which is just another way to kind of isolate that. And then it's D2 extension, right? These are the 4 big movements. So just to say it again to everyone, vertical jump, trunk rotation, shot put, D2 extension. If you just think about the kinetic chain, it's vertical jump, it's getting force into the ground. It's trunk rotation. That's your ability to start to transfer that. It's then shot put. It's how well can you then transfer that into your upper extremity. And then it's the isolation of how much power and stability does your upper extremity possess. And, Proteus is a way to really, really efficiently test that.
Yeah.
But also train it, and that's the thing is you can use Proteus in particular as a training device for all these movements, but it's just giving you an insight on how to train it, even off the system, different ranges, that type of thing. But all that saying, it doesn't go back to the other, I would never shut out any of the other fundamentals that haven't changed for me. You have to have the range of motion and all that stuff too.
That's what I think is so important about this whole dialogue is like, this isn't pushing out conventional training in any way.
No.
Really, it's what it's telling you is we have a targeted way to figure out where maybe conventional doesn't work as well as it used to, right? If you run all these tests on a bunch of 15-year-olds, all the vertical jumps are going to be terrible. They're all
Yeah.
untrained. They all need to learn how to put more force in the ground to be successful. It's going to turn up on these tests. In fact, you might find in that data set that there are a couple like actually very efficient rotators that if they just learn how to put more force in the ground, good things are going to happen, right? Put 20 pounds on them and add 100 pounds to their squat, and we're going to be in a totally different place. So I love that it allows us to be a lot more calculated than maybe we were in the past. And, it's cool because I think we get better with it year after year because the data gets more refined. So thank you for grinding it out in the trenches of Microsoft Excel for us. I asked this question 14 months ago, but it's probably warranted to ask again. What's next for Proteus? Where do you think we can gather more data, make better inferences, assist the training process for coaches and rehab folks?
Yeah, I mean, obviously as we've started out, we start out with baseball. So most of our data and our best data comes from baseball. So really
Yeah.
it comes to just expanding this
Yeah.
same inferences. It's diving deeper into baseball. I like those questions that you have about like now we look at like injury rates in these specific areas. Like, with baseball, we're going to start to cut deeper, right? Deeper and deeper, I think, and find more details. But then other than that, it's expanding these same type of insights into other
Mhm.
sports. And as we expand, into obviously golf, we have some very similar data. It's probably our next biggest sport after baseball. Then we look at combat sports, which is like an area where, gosh, like they have so many different physiological needs of rotational power and power endurance
Yeah.
and the ways that we can test that. Obviously, body weight is big. It's a body weight sport. So how that power to weight ratio, comes into effect. That's all going to be big, but also we're expanding into the gym pop space.
Yeah.
So, that's our biggest area of expansion where I think, again, if we go back to the power penia discussion, basically giving people a power age. That's something as you age, you want to have a higher power age, or sorry, a lower power age
Yeah.
than your chronological age,
Yeah.
right? If you're 35, you want to try to maintain a power age of 25. And we've actually released this to our systems. You can go right now, do a general power test on Proteus.
Mhm.
And as long as you're not labeled an athlete in our system, meaning you're not a college professional or high school athlete, if you're an amateur athlete or just a gen popper, we will give you your power age from that test. And that's going to be something that we continue to expand on, as we try to kind of bring this message of power being this really important biomarker for aging. And that's for both men and as we talked about for women. And I've been watching the Olympics a lot.
Yeah.
Obviously the last couple of weeks, and been really getting into sports. And something that really strikes me is I think for the U.S. in particular, it's the women that are bringing those golds home. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? And it's the importance, I think, of really steadily chopping away at the myth that women shouldn't be training for strength and power. And it's something even my wife mentioned to me, that she has noticed that, within her circles and even within older, people older than her, the understanding that strength training and power training is important for women as well. And
Yeah.
they should not ignore it. They're not going to become, they all used to, the
Yeah.
fear all used to be that they're going to turn into, Arnold Schwarzenegger if they
Yeah.
lift some weights, which we know as professionals that's not going to happen. Well, that message I think is really starting to really stick now, and I think continuing to beat that drum of this is important to you maintain a healthy lifespan.
Mhm.
We want to keep surfacing things that bring that to the forefront. So that's going to be kind of, I think, our next,
Yeah.
something that we keep doing from a testing standpoint. Um, but we're going to continue to build tools that help athletes analyze. So something else that will be coming out later this year for the athletes that I think will be really, really helpful is a comparison tool. So when you get done with a test, the number one question we always get is, how do I compare to a professional athlete, right? You can look at your data and you compare, high school athletes to other high school athletes and all this stuff, but how does it compare to a college athlete to a pro athlete? Well, we're actually going to put in a tool that when you're done, you'll be able to see like, here's your power compared to the high school athlete, but you're going to be able to immediately look and see how for each movement, this compares across the different skill levels. So it'll be a way for you to see how far away from are you from these desirable goals of, if you're a high school athlete, of getting into college, at the pro level. And obviously everyone wants to just compare themselves to pros. So we want to give the people what they want, but the important thing is really just comparing to that next level and see, so that they can see what they need to achieve. Um, and then I think the last thing, and I mentioned it earlier, is just something that we're going to keep working as a way to make it easier for our customers to generate programs based on the Proteus
Yeah.
results. And I think that's always been something that, facilities like you and people with lots of training knowledge, they see the Proteus data and they go, boom, I know what to do. Like, they need to train this, they need to train this. Here's how that program's going to look. But not everyone that we work with is Eric Cressey. And we want to kind of help make that easier for people,
Yeah.
and at least give them a place to start and say, okay, well, if we were to design a program based on what we know about their output, who they are, what sport they play, all this stuff, here's the program we would recommend.
Yeah.
And now they can go in and change that. Now, the version of that right now is a CSV. It spits that out immediately into a
Yeah.
basic CSV. They can use that in Excel and all this stuff. But it's probably the number one thing we've had requested, and we finally have it released now. As you know, as this, like I said, this is probably the first recording of any kind of media that we've done where this has actually been out for people to try. So yeah, there you go. So
Hot
that
off the
is out,
presses.
and that's just our very basic version right now, and we're going to evolve that over time. Like I said, maybe eventually get into more integrations with other training apps and things like that. But for now, the main goal is to really give coaches this nice starting point, and it also gives athletes a reason to want to come back, because these programs, they're only, we only give 12 workouts, so 3 a week for 4 weeks for a reason, which is like, you need to come back in and test again. You need to be reassessed, or something, before we can say for sure if this program is now the right thing for you. Hopefully you gain some in some areas, come in, test again, we give you another 4 weeks. So that's kind of our
Yeah.
general kind of trajectory over the next year.
That's tremendous. And I'm excited to kind of be involved in all this. We're obviously the data collectors, but I'm also the lucky recipient of a lot of this information on the early end. So I appreciate OS
Yeah.
supporting us. If folks want to learn more about Proteus, it's proteusmotion.com/elite. Definitely some really good insights there. I know the company's always awesome about if people want to demo it, finding a facility local where they can go and check it out. We often do tours at our facility for folks that are intrigued on it. Really has been an absolute difference maker, for the way that we, both assess and train athletes. Will, can't thank you enough for carving out some time and sharing some of these insights with us. Hopefully, all of our listeners find them to be really useful.
Thanks again for having me on. Always a pleasure. And I look forward to coming on again sometime in the
Let's
future
do
and
it.
doing the next deep dive. So
First 4-time guest, right?
anytime.
Thanks, Will.
All right. Take care.